Okay, right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for agreeing to meet us, Louisa, and welcoming us to your beautiful house here. So we have some questions,
Hmm.
and the first question we wanted to ask: what were the reasons that brought you to the Slocan Valley, and are you able to describe the sort of push and pull factors that brought you to this area?
Well, that's very simple. I had been living in communes. I came from Southern California, Santa Monica, California, I was born, and I lived in Beverly Hills at the time. And then, as a small child, my family moved to Bel Air. And for all kinds of various reasons, I did not want the lifestyle that my parents had or that was set out before me. And I was looking for a place in the wilderness. And I lived in Northern California on several communes around the Mendocino area in the process. And I had a daughter whose name was Eurydice. And we started calling her Sweet Pea at that time. And I wasn't happy there. I stayed there for a year and I wasn't happy there. Too political, too close to San Francisco, to California. And I really wanted to get further out and farther in. And that brought me to Canada. I I was hitchhiking from Vancouver because someone had told me that there were some people from Russia called the Spirit Wrestlers, and they were living in the Kootenays, and that Oliver maybe was one of those. I saw Oliver on a map, and I liked the book. I liked the play Oliver, which was Dickens, and I said, "Oh, I'll go to Oliver," but I didn't really know. I was just hitchhiking, and somewhere before Manning Park, a fella named Michael Kaplan came and picked me up. He was heading from Vancouver to the property that he had just bought with a little inheritance he got from his grandfather. And he was a draft dodger because as soon as he got this inheritance, he dropped out of medical school where he was very close to getting his doctorate, but he got this money and he wanted to get out, so that made him a draft dodger. And he came to Canada and he wanted to live on a commune. So he met a fella in Vancouver whose name was Tor Sinclair. And Tor Sinclair was from Chicago. No, he was from Denver, Colorado. And he too was a draft dodger. And as far as I know, he came up by himself. And so did Michael Kaplan. And Michael started talking to me. I'm gathering people for I'm going to start a commune, and I bought some property in Valakan. And he said, I have 10 acres, and I paid $6,000 maybe. I don't know for sure what he paid, but somewhere around $6,000 for 10 acres. And we've got a house there. There's a house on the property, and it's 10 acres. And it's really close to the Slocan River, but not on the river. And if you want, you could come and live with us. And I had my daughter, whose name was Sweet Pea, and she was 1 year old. And it was April of 1970 when I arrived in Valakan at this property that Michael Kaplan bought. And there at the property was this fella, Tor Sinclair. And they were the beginning of this little commune that was getting started. And they were very happy to have me and Sweet Pea join the group. And Michael got restless. We were gardening and we had some goats and we had some chickens. And there's still some old outbuildings there. And the old house is still there in Valakan. And it has this gray siding of some sort on it. But we lived there for that first year of 1970. And during that year, we met people from the Morton place, which was John Morton and Judy Morton. Judy is still in the valley. I can contact you with her possibly. I know I can, because I know right where she lives. She's no longer on that property. They called it Morton Place. And then there was also Bradford and Christine Cowan, who had come from Colorado. And these people came up from California and Colorado. And they didn't have any children yet, but they started having children. And I was involved with the birth of Ellie, who was the daughter of John and Judy. And then Brad and Christine had a boy who they called him Grundoon, but his real name was Jesse Cowan. And they still live in the valley, not on any communes. That commune fell apart. But before it fell apart, a few other people had lived there. Anthony Arnold is one who now still lives in Ryandale, and we're very close friends all these years. And they ended up living at Harmony Gates also. But that was many years later, and they rented Louisa's house. Louise was with Bob Nelson. And Bob Nelson and Michael Bopp were in Slocan Park, and they had a group called the Sun Blossoms. And the Sun Blossoms were always, Michael Bopp, who was in the movie that we just saw, he was always wanting to gather people, and he sort of liked talking and preaching, and he does a lot of it in that movie. And he loved gathering people and everything. And Michael Kaplan got a little restless and wasn't really settling down on this property that he had bought with this inheritance. But Tor was totally into it, and I was totally into it. And Sweet Pea, she'd do anything I did because I was her mother. And Michael Kaplan and Tor and I all went to the coast and decided, well, we'll go sailing for a while. Michael wanted to do a few things. So he bought another sailboat. It was just really a dinghy off of a big, like maybe a ferry dinghy. Pretty good size. And there were 4 of us that traveled around that summer of 71. So after Harmony Gates. No, it was before Harmony Gates, sure, because Michael Kaplan never moved to Harmony Gates. Michael Kaplan liked Lund, and so he decided to stay in Lund, and he had a whole story there, which we won't go into because that's his story. But after a while of sailing around, Tor and I both felt that we wanted to go back to Slocan Valley. We were not really a couple, but people saw us that way because we were traveling around together, and we had my daughter, and he adored her, and so we looked like a little family, and we were a family, but we weren't really a couple. And I never was coupled with Michael Kaplan. When I say coupled, I guess that means sexual partners. And we were never those things, but we were certainly a family of sorts. And while Tor and Michael and I were doing this sailing up Reavers Inlet and around past Lund, there was a fellow whose name was Gary Strauss, and he stayed at the farm in Valakan and took care of things there. And he was from Pennsylvania, and he too was a draft dodger. And he too was looking for a commune of some sort. And so while we had him there with us in Valakan, and we said, well, we're going to go away. And there was a woman named Laurel, and she had had a child with a fella named Moss. And the child's name was Lola, something like that. And she somehow was with Gary, and they were going to stay at Vatican while we did this sailing thing. And then Tor and I both decided to come back. And that was the first summer, winter of 70. Because, like I said, I came in April. So by this time, we've gotten into more just living. And that's when we met all those other people from Morton Place. And there was another commune called the Funkwells in Slocan Park. And I have stories on all that too, but I'll jump over that because I'm supposed to talk about Harmony Gates. But I could go on forever. Anyway, Tor and I met Louise Nelson and Bob Nelson and Michael Bopp and Judy Epp, and decided that we could all join together and move to this property that had been purchased in Perry Siding by a group of people who had all been part of the Sun Blossoms. One name that really was major was John Jowsey. He put the most money in to purchase the property. And he went back to Ontario, where he was from. He was quite a bit older. We looked at him as an old man. He was maybe 40. But we saw him as an old man. I never actually met him as a commune person. He went back to Ontario and had some kind of a break, psychotic break, and tried to burn his ex-wife's house down. He was arrested and put into Pentanguishene, which is, as far as I know, a psychiatric prison. And he lived his life out there, never to return. And lots of letters were written back and forth between he and Michael Bopp. And then some of the other of the people ended up also. So at that point that we decided that we were going to pick up stakes in Vatican and move to the property in Perry Siding, Tor and Gary, who now had become part of the family, that was me, Tor, Gary, and Sweet Pea, my daughter. And they both loved Sweet Pea. They both loved me. We were really like brothers and sisters and one kid. And we all really did love each other. And Michael Kaplan stayed at the coast and didn't care about any of this stuff. He decided to stay in Lund, which he did. And so this was decided that we were all going to move up to Perry Siding. And the property that is now known as the Vatican Hole, WHOLE, we decided, well, we'll just donate this to this other group, the Carpenters, and they have a daughter who's still around, Monica Carpendale, and she had a brother, and there was Blaze and Margot, and there was a bunch of other people at the Carpendale area. I don't know that they ever were considered a commune there. I don't know what their deal was. They were quite a bit older, the Carpendales. Anyway, we were all gathering in the valley for Christmases and different stuff. And one of the things that happened was people wanted to form some kind of a community thing. And we said, well, we'll give this property to that, because Michael gave it to us and he doesn't care about it anymore. And so we'll donate that to this. And then we moved up to this property in Perry Siding. And that property was called the Hole, Hole, because a whole bunch of people were going to make a community building, and a hole had been dug. And people for years would say, oh, I'm going to go work on the hole for a while. And it was sort of like the valley place where people would gather and work together to build this community. However, us up in Perry Siding lost connection. It was a long ways. We didn't do much. We washed our hands of it. We told Michael Kaplan what happened, and he says, "Oh, that's fine with me. It's fine with me to just give it over." And my understanding from T.C. Carpendale, who I believe is passed now, she told me that they wanted to pay Michael for the property. And my understanding is that they gave him like $400 a month for enough years to make $6,000 or something like that. And it was just a dribble when they could, and that was fine with him. He didn't really care. He made lots of money. He went back, got his medical degree, became a doctor, and if there was any way to ever reconnect with Michael, I would love to see him again. Michael Kaplan. He was a wonderful fella. I loved him dearly, but he's lost to me. And TC was always going to try and connect me, but it never did happen. Anyway, so then this group of people, now we've got Tor and Gary and me and Sweet Pea and Michael Bopp and Judy Epp and Bob and Louise Nelson and their daughter Morning Glory. So that we had Sweet Pea and Morning Glory. And then from that nucleus of people, all these other people, Michael Bopp was always gathering people and trying to bring people in and wanting a bigger commune and wanting more. And a person who came very soon on was Danny Debris. And she had a baby whose name was, we all called him Shmee. I don't even remember his real name. But then Shmee's father, her actual husband, and that pot that I showed you that was in your picture was a wedding present to Tom and Danny Debris when they got married, before he became a draft dodger, and they all came up. But by the time Harmony Gates, well, we didn't have that name yet. By the time he came to that property, so then we had Danny, and then Tom came too, but they weren't a couple anymore. But there was Tom and Shmee and Danny. And Danny was there for a good part of that main summer. There was this main summer that we all had. And Danny was there for that, and so was Tom. And Tom stayed as a major player in the Harmony, well, it wasn't Harmony Gates yet, in that property. We just called it the property at that time. And then there was the two fellows that were in that picture, Ricky Asali and Ricardo. I don't know Ricardo's last name, but the woman he had with her years later came into my life, and we have remained good friends to this day, even though we weren't really connected much then. He was the main player. He passed on and he left. Ricky Asali has passed on and he's left. A lot of people came through that passed on and left. But I'm losing track of where I was in the story. So this nucleus of people, I'm trying to remember who else was, and then there was this woman, Darlene. Oh, right. And the one woman who came with a fella, we called him Kelly, but his real name was James, and he was a redhead. And he and Mary, her name was Van Krugel at the time. And that dulcimer belonged to her. And it's in the movie. And she remained at Harmony Gates and became a major player in the family that did remain for a while longer than everything else. James, who we called Kelly, left and went to the new family. And what happened to him there? You'd have to get that from Lynn or from Nancy. I don't know what happened to him.
Okay.
And then, so one day, Louise and I were hitchhiking to town with our laundry, of all the laundry we could get to take into the Pink Maid, it was called, and it was on Baker Street. Now it's an antique store. And we would all go there to do our laundry if we just couldn't handle anything else. And Louise and I were gone for the day, and I guess Michael Bopp did this I Ching, and it you can see it on that sign, the I Ching, and I guess it's something in the I Ching where the words Harmony Gates is written, and that's where the name came from. And when we got home, we were told that we now had a name, and we were called Harmony Gates, and we couldn't stand the name. We thought it was just horrible. It was so tacky. But that's the name, and Michael Bopp got it out of the I Ching. And I can't imagine that Bob was ever in on that either, but possibly he was. And that, so I guess we've gotten, do you want to ask another question, or do we want to
just a couple
get
of things,
to Acacia's?
so just a bit more about the Harmony Gates Commune, how it was organised, how were decisions made, and how do you deal with disagreements?
Okay, well,
yeah.
That's obvious what happened. There was a lot of disagreements. There were a lot of transients. One of the transients who was known in the valley for years' name was Ted Taylor, and he ended up committing suicide, as did some of the gully commune. There were communes all over the place, little ones, big ones, and I'm sorry, what was the question again?
So really, how was the commune organised?
Okay, there was no organization. There was lots of different opinions, and Michael Bopp always had these opinions, and they were always very flowery, and he was always wanting to create this beautiful commune where everybody was in harmony and everything was like that. Bob Nelson was the guy who would go out and get the firewood and build the table and put up the shelves, and Tor was the guy who had a chainsaw and would do the firewood, and we built, Tor, myself, Gary, Tom Debris, and a fellow who's still around but way up the Lardo, whose name was Stephen O'Shea, and he is a major player in the whole everything. But he would never commit to being at the farm, the land, Harmony Gates. He didn't like the whole foo-foo stuff that went on about being so spiritual and everything. He wasn't that guy at all. He was also a draft dodger, but he had come quite a bit before. But he was around, and he also lived in that A-frame. We built this A-frame, really, right from the ground up. We did the logs, we peeled the logs, we put up this A-frame. The A-frame's in the pictures. And Stefan played a major part in teaching us how to do this. He taught people how to make split rail fences and how to crisscross them and stuff like that. And Tom Debris built the very first house that was in the very beginning of the property, but you haven't been up there. But if you go up there, there's a house. It's all changed. There's nothing's the same. The old log house was original, and it had cow shit, and it was just cows drifting through. And Bob and Louise, that's what we used for our communal kitchen. And Bob and Louise ended up turning it into a fairyland, beautiful log house that they lived in until 76 or 77 when Bob died, and that's a whole nother story. But the original commune was these various people, and so the Sun Blossoms were going to take the log house, and the Valican people, which I was one of, we were going to build this A-frame, which we did, and I lived in that A-frame until 1983. And Tor and Gary and I were the first people to actually move onto the property and sleep there and make it. There was an old, it became known as the welding shop, but it was just like an old chicken coop down around the parking lot area. And we cleaned that thing out, and we put some beds in there, and Mary, we called her Mary Seaweed, but her name was Van Krugel then. And so there was Mary Seaweed, Gary Strauss, Tor, myself, and Stephen O'Shea when he was around. And he would stay in that shed thing with us. And then there was the log place. And up there were Bob and Louise and Morning Glory and Michael Bopp and Judy Epp. But we all used that as our communal area. And people started branching out and taking these old broken down buildings that were there and turning them into something. The A-frame was the only thing built at that time from start by us hippies. You know, we weren't hippies anymore now. We were back to the landers. But, I mean, certainly if anybody saw me on the street, they would have called me a hippie. And I was certainly known as a hippie chick. But by this time, we were back to the landers. And communists. Not communists, but communists, you know. We had some terminology. And one of the main themes was the meditators and the yahoos. Now, the yahoos, everybody liked to take some LSD. Everybody liked to smoke marijuana, but nobody had any of these things. It was the people that came through that brought these products to us. Nobody grew any pot. Nobody had any drugs, but they did come, and we all would take them. And I do remember one of the main themes was the yahoos I was one of the yahoos. And we were the people that would run around and have acid trips and have a lot of fun with our acid trips. And then there were the meditators. And they were, Michael Bopp and Judy Epp were definitely on the meditator side of things. And they would meditate and levitate when they would do the drugs. But Louise was definitely one of the yahooers, and Bob was always very individual. He was definitely more than a team player. When all these family meetings would be going on and we'd be trying to decide, are we going to put a garden in? Where are we going to put the garden? How are we going to do this, that, and the other thing? Bob would just pick up his axe and go out and cut firewood. He was so stable in his process of life. But like he built that little shed I pointed out, and he put that together. Somehow there was a fella in town called Junkie John, and we could all go to Junkie John, and that's where we got the frying pan, and we would get all these things from Junkie John that we could use. And Mike and Bob Nelson, probably Tor was right in there helping too. Tor's name, by the way, wasn't really Tor Spears. No, Tor Sinclair. It was Donald Spears. And after Amethyst amnesty and all that kind of stuff, he went back to the States. He never stayed. And Michael Kaplan, he did go back to the States too. Stephen O'Shea has remained in the Kootenays, and he lives up the Lardo. And Tom DeBree became a tree planter during his years in the valley, and he died in a kayak accident. And he was very good friends with Brad and Christine Cowan, who lived at Morton Place. And they are still in the valley as just a couple. And then and Judy Morton has returned to the valley years ago, and she lives in Slocan Park now. But they were in Passmore. And these communes we all kind of went around and had connections with each other.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah. But there was a lot of arguing about and it was the Yahoos basically who did the gardening. And it was Yahoos definitely who were doing firewood. And there was cows, and we all would milk cows, and we all would take care of chickens, and we had goats, and there was the one cow who's in the picture. And you've seen some goats. Those goats came with us from Valican.
Okay.
I don't know, am I answering your questions?
Yeah,
okay?
You are. You're doing fantastic. Thank you very much. What sort of skills did you learn when you were...
I didn't learn any skills in Harmony Gates from being at Harmony Gates other than how to basically survive relationship with all these various things. There was constant people coming through because Michael Bopp was always gathering people from everywhere and bringing them to the commune of Harmony Gates, which he named it.
Okay. And what was daily life like?
Daily life was all these various things. There was a lot of sweeping out these old buildings. There was lots of old buildings. There was another old building. I don't even know what it was. It was an old log building, crashed in ceiling and everything. And this is a funny one too. But somehow Michael Bopp and I set up sleeping areas in this old building that was all broken down. We cleaned it out, and now I don't know where Judy left for a while. She went off. I don't know where she went or what happened to her, but she went off for a while, and Michael Bopp and I somehow both set up sleeping areas in this old broken down shed. And I don't know where Tor and Gary and Tom DeBree and Stephen O'Shea, probably everybody was just sort of sleeping around. We were building the A-frame at this time, and the A-frame was for us Valican folks. But it wasn't built enough for anybody to be living in it yet. And that's somehow I got into this old shed with Michael Bopp, and he slept on one side and I slept on the other side, and we had this rug, and we had sawdust on the floor, and we would pick I was always picking the sawdust off the rug. And he and I lived in there for maybe a month or two, quite peacefully, actually. And Louise and Bob were living up in the log house, and all the kids slept up at the log house, except for when I lived in this shed, and Sweet Pea would sleep with me. And Bob Nelson, he built himself a loft in the barn where the cow was, and he was living in there. And he also put together Tor, I'm sure Tor helped, and Tom DeBree probably helped, and they built that little shed into a laundry wash area. And we would go in there. Can I do this without losing my thing? Because I'm getting a little chilled. Okay. And he, I lost what I was talking about.
So you were talking about the shed there?
Oh, and in there Bob somehow located a Ringer washing machine, and we had a water tank that was about this wide and maybe that tall, and Bob was very good at all this stuff. He had this little thing where you could put little pieces of firewood underneath this big tank and heat this whole thing up with hot water, and in this little shed that you could see in there, it looks like he was in the process of making it in that picture. And we could go in there and we could do the laundry, and we could wash ourselves and we could wash the kids, and that's how we did our laundry. But sometimes it would just get overwhelming, and some of us would. There was a few vehicles around. Mary Seaweed brought a Volkswagen van when she came. And that was one of Michael Bopp's rules. Whatever you came with became communal property, and you couldn't leave with it. So Mary ended up having to leave without her Volkswagen van. And she was there for a good 2 years. And then there was Darlene, who's also in those pictures, and she was a major commune person for a few years. And finally, they just got tired of the whole thing too, and they left. But then Mary came back and found me, and we had a whole nother, and I still can contact her. Mm-hmm. But that's a whole other story. And somehow, Ricky Asali, who's in one of those pictures, he and Darlene knew each other. I know he was Lebanese. She looks like she could have been too, and they maybe knew I don't think they were a couple, but they could have been. I don't remember all that.
What do you do? Because did you have any power or any hot water? Or?
Well, this was our hot water. Mm-hmm. We had no power. We had no electricity at the property at all. That's the story of Bob's dying, if you want to get to that story, which is further along in the whole process.
Okay. Right.
But okay.
And what about in terms of you had a garden there? What sort of vegetables?
Okay, so Michael Bopp got a grant, and we made the most incredible garden in the second field, the biggest field, which was right where the barn was. And that year, Mary Seaweed, Gary Strauss, myself, I would say Danny Debris worked in there quite a bit, and, Darlene and maybe Ricky, some people, but Gary Strauss and Mary Seaweed, I would say, did the major thing on this garden. Michael Bopp liked to design things, and we'll put a circle here, we'll have flowers, and then we'll put the vegetables, and so I can remember we'd have garden meetings, and just the garden people who were doing gardening. And then there were the builder people who did building. And I was and then there were the cooks, who was the cooks, because we all did eat together. So I was kind of on all these teams. I didn't do any one thing. I was never specializing in anything. And Judy Epp did come back at some point here, and then I think she probably did this, that, and the other thing. She probably did some cooking and some cleaning and gardening. I don't think she did too much building. But and then she was pregnant, and then we had Akasha's birth, which was a very major event for me and for everybody else. But that's further in the story. So Louise was major in house cleaning, cooking, keeping the communal house functioning. And we had a bunch of kids, because we had Morning Glory, Sweet Pea, Shmee, And then there was that woman I told you about, Maria, who came with these two little, a little bit of black blood, African black blood in them, Tairu and Yoruba. And I told you that whole story. I don't know if you want that now. It's part of the whole story. And then there was a period of time when Al and Connie Trices came, but they never really were part of the commune. They stayed out in the first field. Michael Bopp somehow got them and brought them up to the property, and they made a little camp out there. And they had 3 children, and I think she might have been pregnant with her 4th. She had 3 girls and a boy. And she is still around, and her name is now, she uses her grandmother's name, Rubia. And she is definitely an old valley woman who'd be worth talking to. And I might be able to find her and help you connect with her if you want. But they never became part of the commune. And I think this Maria and her 2 little kids were connected to them. Connie she also had black blood in her, and she also had Indian. And so she was a mixed blood person. And she, and Al Trices stayed in the valley. Al died. They didn't stay together. The story goes on. But there's a woman named Rita, a redheaded woman named Rita, who got together with that Al Trices guy. And they were together for quite a while. And she was very involved. She's still around. And she's still very involved with big-time valley stuff.
So
She
you were
even wrote a
growing
book.
vegetables?
We grew vegetables and lots of flowers.
Did you sell those in markets? Or
No,
was it
no,
all just
no,
for the
no, no.
commune?
We never had even made enough. We couldn't grow enough food for ourselves. What we really could sell was we could sell milk. We could make butter. I still have the old butter churn too from the farm. We could make butter and sell it, and milk. But mostly during the real commune days, there was never really enough. We didn't sell anything. We had chickens. Later, we ended up getting sheep and cows and a pig. But that was after. Then we were living communally, where we had houses. Each family had houses. And that was later on, though, way after. So we were living communally, and we shared the cow, we shared the gardens, and we would help each other, get firewood and all those kinds of things. But that was further along from the real Harmony Gates things. Things really sort of fell apart after Akasha's birth.
Okay. So can you tell us about Akasha's birth then? What was...
Okay. Now, like I said before, Judy and I were never girlfriends. We were never really that close. She came from a Mennonite family, and how she and Michael Bopp got together, I don't really know, but they came together. And Akasha, she was pregnant with Akasha, and I said me and Michael were living in that thing. Well, I moved out of there, and she moved back in. She had been away for a while, and then she came back, and then she moved in there with Michael. And they were living in that building. During the major commune time, Gary Strauss and Mary Seaweed and, I don't know, a bunch of us all got together and made a much more official sauna. And I think there might be some remains of that old sauna there. It was sort of near this shed that Michael and I were in for a while, and then Judy moved in, and by then the A-frame was done, and I moved over with the A-frame group, and that was Tor, like I said before, Tor and Gary and Tom Debris and Stephen O'Shea and myself and my daughter Sweet Pea. And so we were all in this little A-frame, kind of sleeping around on the floor, basically. We had no bathroom. We had an outhouse, which was also an A-frame, close by. And we had we managed to get a running tap of water outside. And we had a pretty funky kitchen set up in there. And years later, we did manage, I mean, things happened differently once it became more of a communal living than the commune. The commune really didn't last very long. So Akasha's birth, it was in this old shed that Michael Bopp and I were living in there for a while. And he and Judy were living in there. And there was another group in the valley called the Red and the Blue. Have you heard of them? Okay. And they came when we were still in Valakan. And we kind of connected with them. And we had a lot of fun with these people. They were a funny group. It was two men, Robin and RJ. No, Jay. Blue Jay. They all had funny names. Robin, like the bird. Blue Jay. Mama Llama, who is now called M.L. Thompson, and I think she's the one who told you my name. She lives in Caslow. We're very good friends. And Tor, maybe Tom Debris was there, but I remember Judy didn't want me to come to her birth. For some reason. She said I would steal the show, is what I remember her saying. And I just begged and pleaded until she finally said, okay. And Robin of the Red and Blue, there was also Teddy Bear and Unicorn and Pony. That was the Red and Blue. Now, I don't know if all those people came to that birth, but for sure Robin did, because like Michael Kaplan, he had been in medical school, and I think he actually had managed to get a degree as a doctor. And they came up from Berkeley, this group of people called the Red and Blue. And they had another commune across the highway. They moved around and they did various things. They rented. Everybody kind of rented for a while, except for us, because Michael Kaplan bought from George and Sheila Griffiths their house, and then they moved, and we all helped them build another house. And there was a lot of everybody helping everybody move and build houses and things like that. But so at this birth, Robin played doctor. I know in that tape that Michael Bopp talked about delivering the baby. And I have no doubt that he managed to be there to catch the last bit of this baby. But Robin very clearly was the doctor there delivering this baby. And I was very interested in the whole process because I'd already had 2 babies in my life. My first one I gave up for adoption, and the second one was Sweet Pea. And her name was actually Eurydice at birth, but we called her Sweet Pea. And I was no longer with her father by the time I came to Canada. And I was basically taught how to deliver a baby by Robin of the Red and Blue. And it was Akasha, Michael and Judy's baby. That was the birth that I learned how to deliver a baby. And I went on to be the first Valley midwife. And we delivered, with my newfound skills, I delivered many babies in those years. And one of those babies was Bob and Louisa's baby in that log house. And Carolyn DeMarco, who became the Valley Doc, she came from Ontario, and she came to the Valley to set up her practice, and she's written books. Do you know who I'm talking about? She was quite known in the Valley and everywhere. And she came to be the doctor to deliver the baby. And in the process, she had done, obviously, a lot of medical school because she was a doctor. But she'd never done a home birth. And it was time to start to do things that probably the nurses did in the hospital. And so I ended up delivering Louise and Bob's second child, whose name was Joshua Eli Nelson. And he was born in 1975. And I delivered him with Carolyn. And she's always given me credit for being the person who taught her how to do a home birth. And I learned it from Robin. And there were many other babies that were connected to all these other communes that I also was involved with.
Fantastic. Okay.
So that was why that birth was so important.
Yes, definitely. That's great, and you are learning skills then on the commune there.
Yeah, I learned a skill, how to deliver a baby, and I used it for years, but I would never do it again.
Okay.
I guess if I had to. You start having a baby and it was just us, I would do it. I could still do it.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to another question here. How important was spiritualism to your communal life?
Oh, it was very important. Everybody was spiritual, but we all had different ideas of what that meant. And what ultimately happened in the spiritual dimension of Harmony Gates was, first of all, there was just, I think this is even before anything even known as New Age. Certainly nobody really knew anything. We all had come, and I can remember when I first got to Vancouver, I saw these men with turbans, and I thought, oh, I can go find myself a guru. And I went and tried to get into what I now know are the Sikh community. They had no interest in this hippie chick and a baby coming and being involved with them. And I remember going to a Buddhist place, and they were real Chinese or Japanese Buddhists. I don't know. They were Oriental people. And again, they were not interested in having me come and be part of their commune. And it was through this searching around, trying to find a place, that I heard about these spirit wrestlers, which I found out later were Doukhobors. And so I was heading out to find these Doukhobors. But by the time I got there, the people in the Sun Blossoms they were right in Slocan Park, which was a very Doukhobor neighborhood. And there were lots of Doukhobors that they started connecting up with and being friends with. But up in Perry Siding, there were less. There were more in the Appledale area, but less. That part was less. But I did become very close to a lot of Doukhobor people in the years I lived there. But I lived there far beyond any commune. But we're only talking about the commune days, and they were pretty short.
All right. And what sort of people did you have? What sort of connections did you have with people outside of the communes when you were there? You say you were to.
Just one sec. Sorry, can we hide this a bit?
Yep.
Yeah. Just check it in my thing.
Okay.
Sorry.
You say you were going to Nelson and doing laundry, obviously.
Right.
But, what sort of connections did you have with people?
Like other hippie type people?
Well, other hippie people,
Alternative
yes.
type people?
Alternative, back to the landers, certainly.
Although those kinds of people?
Yes.
Well, we all had like I said, we would get together and we'd have these big gatherings. One place where a lot of big gatherings was at the Morton place, which John is dead. him and Judy had split up, and he got together with a woman named Joyce, who had been in another little commune with a fella named Robert Phelps, and it was Joyce and Robert, and they had come together, and they were always at these gatherings, and she has remained my very dear friend all these years. She too lives in Port Townsend, and I delivered their child, Micah. Micah was hit by a car and was killed at 6 years old. And that's a whole nother story. And they were kind of connected up with the Flying Heart area and the Beckjords and Bing and Helen and all those people. There were definitely, and Pat and Dan Armstrong came up, and they had 4 kids. And I mean, all the stories are so interlocked. I know all the stories, but they're way bigger than just the original commune thing. Mm-hmm. But I could go into great depths about all these things because I remember everything.
Were you involved in organizing any events at all together? Any festivals?
No.
Or anything like that at all?
No.
Okay.
Not to my knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't organize anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
It was just enough trying to... One thing we did a lot of was we had a lot of soybeans, and we made a lot of... We started off as vegetarians, but we had these cows and these goats for milk, and they have babies. You don't get milk without babies. And then we started off selling the baby goats to the Italians in Trail. And then we realized, well, they're just killing them and eating them. And here we are starving on just milk and vegetables. And we weren't great farmers, really. I mean, we had this gorgeous garden that one year, but it wasn't like this went on for many years. It all ended up, everything split up. The actual commune of Harmony Gates really didn't last but a few years, like maybe 83, from 71. I think we moved on the property in March of 71, and I think by certainly way before Josh's birth, it was all just communal houses, a few communal houses. Gary stayed. He married a woman named Becky. Bob and Louise were in the log house. Tor had left. Tom DeBree had left. Stephen O'Shea never was really there. He was always just passing through. Michael Kaplan left a long time before. So there was always lots of movement. And then Michael Bopp and Judy left. And one time they came back to visit, and I was still living on the property. But that's a whole nother story. I can go into it, but that's more of the communal house. I married. I had 3 more kids. And I lived there until 83. But that was not the same as this commune of Harmony Gates. We never lived down the name, though. We never, to this day, never lived down the name of Harmony Gates.
Do you have any connections with the Quakers of Argenta at all?
No.
Anything,
None other than I remember going up. I still will go. I don't know what's going on now. I know Bill. I know ML, who was Mama Llama of the Red and Blue. She went and lived in Johnson's Landing with Bill Wells, who she's married to and living in Caslow now. And he was a Quaker, and she was very involved they were very involved, maybe still, because she said she wants to be buried in the Quaker graveyard. And Dick Pollard was a Quaker family. I believe Dick is still alive and living on the coast. But that was the Broken String Band. And John Morton from Morton Place was in the Broken String Band. And Tom DeBree played with these guys, but he died. And he died after Arrest Day came along. Arrest Day was the husband I had for all those years. And Tom was just a dear, sweet friend of everybody, yeah. And then there was Marty Hyken, and so Dick Pollard was he was a Quaker, and when his brother, Bob Eddy, died, you know that story? Of Bob coming up to, well, when Bob Eddy died, Dick Pollard and I took him from the morgue and drove him up to Argenta, and he was buried in the Quaker. So I guess I had quite a bit of Quaker involvement without even quite realizing it, because it was well after the commune days and things had moved on. You asked about the spiritual, and certainly there was lots of levels of spiritual, this, that, and the other thing that people tried to do. Christianity came in big time, and there was a lot of us, myself and Louise, Tom DeBree, certainly Anthony, and his wife Melody, who was part of the Flying Hearts, and Pat Armstrong. All these people they had come up from California. So there was and then Brad and Christine Cowan, who I mentioned earlier, who were part of the Morton group, they became Christians. There was a whole lot of us up there who became Christians, and Patty and Bruce Ray lived past Harmony Gates. They lived past Harmony Gates at least a mile. That was before we called them kilometers. So I can say a mile. And they really lived out there. And Patty and I are still good friends and keep in touch. Bruce and Patty split up, but they lived out there, and they had David and Susan Robertsons living with them, but that didn't last long. And David and Susan ended up buying property from George and Sheila Griffiths, who managed to move all over the valley. The Young Greens, David and Susan and Brad and Christine, all, and the Valican original place were all George Griffith places. And Sheila is still alive, living in Perry Siding with her son. But George is dead. So there was, and she was one of the Christian group too, Sheila, but Bob never was. Bob Nelson never was, and Michael Bopp, and Judy Epp, and Gary Strauss all became Baha'is. Which, do you know that religion? It's a religion that comes out of the Muslim religion, and it's called Baha'i. And they left to go be Baha'i missionaries. And Gary Strauss, when he first joined everybody, he was into Paramahansa Yogananda, which was huge in my childhood because he had a sanctuary on Sunset and the Coast Highway in Malibu. And I used to go there as a young girl, and there were statues of Jesus and all kinds of Hindu statues. And Paramahansa Yogananda his fellowship was, I can't quite remember the name, Self-Realization Fellowship or something like that. So that was all big too. But Gary did that, and he was one of the meditators. So he ended up becoming a Baha'i and going off with his wife Becky. But he built actually Tom DeBree started the first house that's on the property, and then Gary took that house over and turned it into a living place. Tom started it, but it never really happened. There was a lot of building that started and never really did. There was a really decent root cellar there was an old broken down root cellar. The property originally had been called Chernenkov's, and it was Doukhobor. But there were no Doukhobors anywhere around, and they sold it to these Sunblossom people, who were the ones from Slocan Park. And us from Valican, we just were added along. But so there was all these different spiritual traditions that happened for a while here, a while there. We all went through lots of different things, and none of us are what we were today. But we all have, there's some still very deep connections. Very deep.
Brilliant. Can I ask about any opposition that you faced, for coming
This
here?
This is an interesting story.
Yeah.
One of these days, the fellow Ricky Asali, I don't know where we were going or why we were going there, somewhere towards New Denver, but we were hitchhiking. And we had gotten a ride up to before New Denver. And there ended up being a commune there, and it was called, geez, I wish I could remember all these things. It'll come to me, but right now I can't remember it. Anyway, we were standing on the side of the road. You saw the picture of him with the long dark hair, and he was actually Lebanese ancestors. And he and I were standing on the road hitchhiking. I'm the hippie chick. I probably had Sweet Pea with me, and he was the long-haired guy. And we actually got shot at. And someone yelled as they drove by and shot. They didn't shoot at us. I'm sure they were shooting over our heads, because they could have hit us if they knew what they were doing, and they probably did. But they did shoot a gun. And we scrambled down and got out of there. And so that was my biggest opposition. It also happened to me years before in Northern California. The same exact thing. I was hitchhiking again with a different guy. He was more blonde, blue-eyed, bearded. And we were looking like real hippies, and we were hitchhiking. And we got shot at too. And the same thing. Get out of here, you dirty hippies. Yeah. So that happened a couple times. There was a bit of attitude that would come towards us from, I don't know, somehow these people were called rednecks. And they were people who worked highways and did those kinds of maintenance type jobs. Being careful. So there were old valley settler type people. And some of them were fabulous and wonderful. And through the years that I lived there with my husband, Oreste, and I had my 3 kids and all that stuff with Carolyn DeMarco, all that happened. And I had many, many different experiences in that valley from 70 to 84. I lived there. Well, 83 basically. But that's another whole story, why I left and how I ended up here.
Okay. Did you have any dealings with the D Squad?
What?
The D Squad, which I think was looking for
I can't
connections
quite hear
with the Doukhobor.
Oh, the
Sons of
Doukhobor?
Freedoms, and there was something called the D Squad, which we've come
The
across.
D Squad.
Yeah,
I
they were
don't know that name.
Looking at it's like an RCMP group that were looking at for any dealings with the arsonists who were involved with the Sons of Freedom, and
I didn't have
the
any
ACMP.
contact with that. I do remember events happening. Doukhobors were being arrested, and I remember scenes in the courthouse in Nelson where they would take off their clothes. That was all going on, certainly, but it was over here. It wasn't in my life. but I did have a lot of contact with Doukhobor people.
Yeah.
But also, that was later after I was married to Oreste, because I remember being very connected to the women at the co-op at the time when I had my first son, whose name is Antonio, and when he was born. And, I had a lot of contact at that point. But and then later I had a lot more contact through Christian church. We formed there was a whole lot of that happened, but that was all well after the commune days.
Did you ever come across any FBI undercover agents? There are stories of people.
Well, I
coming in.
had a definite personal experience with that, and it led to me being deported. You want that story? Okay. In the process of all this stuff that was going on, all these shifts and everything, I was staying with some people called the Rossies, who had come to the valley. And they had recently come to the valley and bought a house that had belonged to a Doukhobor whose name was Prokofy Varigan. And it was a log house, and I was staying with them. And they were away one day, and they had a camper that they brought with them. And these two men in suits, they might have even had briefcases, came, and I was there alone, and they questioned me about this camper and if these people, the Rossies, were planning to sell it or what they were doing with it. And I didn't really know, and I didn't really care. But these were very good questioners. These men knew what they were doing, and I didn't have a clue. I was just there. I would help out with their kids, and I did some work. I lived there for a period of time, just in between rough stages of other stuff that was going on. And it was, then I was back living at Harmony Gates. I only stayed with these Rossies for a little bit, and they were Christians, and these men had come and asked about that. And it was pretty close after, but at the time, I was at Harmony Gates and I was working in the garden. And I remember I was out there working in the garden naked. I don't know who else was around at the time. I know Gary still lived on the property, and Bob and Louise still lived on the property. I don't remember if Tor was still around, or Tom DeBree, or Stefan certainly wasn't around then. He was always off back and forth. But I was out there, and I know I was naked, and these men came up. Not the same men, different men. It was an immigration man, and his name was Mr. Taylor. And he came and told me that, see, I had come into Canada, but I never had any legal status. I just came up. No one questioned anything in those days. You didn't even need a driver's license to get across the border. You could just come in. I mean, you had a border, but there was nothing big was happening in those days. And I just came into Canada, and I spent some time around Vancouver and down near Tsawwassen and that area. And then I was hitchhiking out to the valley in April. But I first came, it was before that, but I was in the Vancouver area. And anyway, this Mr. Taylor came and questioned me. Oh, he knew, because these other men in the process had found out that I was basically an illegal alien. But it was by their very smart, wise interrogation, basically. But I just was pretty innocent and answered their questions. And I got deported. And Mr. Taylor told me I had 48 hours to get out of the country, and that he was going to meet me at the Greyhound bus depot in Nelson, which at that time was where A3 Plumbing is now. And in the process, me and Mr. Taylor became kind of chummy. He was a very nice man. He told me, and then Gary was there working in the garden too. I mean, I remember when I saw these men, I immediately put clothes on. That's why being naked had something to do with something. And Gary was also working in the garden, and he told Mr. Taylor, he says, well, what if I marry her? Because he, by this time, was a Canadian citizen. He had come up as a draft dodger, but he kept his paperwork all together and did the right things. Tor Sinclair had married a Canadian woman, and he got his paperwork together. And all kinds of different people were scrambling to get stuff together. And I just never bothered with it because nobody cared. I could come and go, and I didn't care. I would, I wasn't going anywhere. I went to Lund, But I got deported. And Gary said, well, what can I... And he said, well, if she marries a Canadian. So Gary says, well, I'll marry her. And I said, oh, great. So I'm going to marry Gary. And... Mr. Taylor said, sure, if you do that, it'll all work. And he was at the bus station, and I don't remember who took me to the bus station or how all that happened, but there was Mr. Taylor, and I was put on that bus, and I was sent to LA, where my parents still lived. And while I was there, I got a little job in a daycare, and I made some money, and I applied for immigration, and Mr. Taylor got me through. And I called him. I said, I can't, in all honesty, marry Gary. I'm not in love with him. I've never even kissed him. But I love him as a friend, but I can't honestly marry him. I just didn't feel good about lying to Mr. Taylor because he had been so kind. And he says, that's okay. I can make this go through. And he made it work, and he helped me become a landed immigrant. And that was 1974. It's on I am now a Canadian citizen and have been since 1986. But from 1973, 1974 until 1986, I went back to not doing anything because I can just go along and not do a lot of different things. So that was my immigration story.
Fantastic. Okay. You tell us about the alternative schools you may be being involved with.
Well, that's a funny one too, because there was no Valican Hole school yet. It was just a hole in the ground, and there was talk of a school. And I do believe at the Morton place, I think Joel Harris, and there was a fella named Fred Eisen. He was a Jewish fella who came to the valley later on than this big 70, 71 commune day, 72. He and Marcia, who is still a major player in the valley, they came, I believe, together, and I think he was involved with the Valican school, but it wasn't, the Valican was, like I said, it had been our place, and we had handed it over, and Michael Kaplan did all that with this group of people, and there was this hole, and people would go and work on the hole But eventually they did get all that together, but I never participated much in any of that. But there was finally a school, but I think the school started at the Morton Place barn. That's what I think, but I don't know for sure.
Okay. Did your children ever attend any of these schools or?
No, my children went to Winlaw, Slocan City, and then this husband who I've talked a little bit about, his name was Oreste, he got very into the whole Christian idea of being, well, this priest who was around, his name was Father Monahan, was going around, and he was I guess he was trying to bring Catholics back into the fold, is what he was doing. And he showed up at my door in the middle of winter with these little shoes, little leather rubber shoes that went over his street shoes. And he showed up my door one day, and he really wanted to get me to go to church. And this man was so determined. He would come every week to visit me, along with Jehovah's Witnesses, who also came through quite a bit. But the Jehovah's Witness didn't have much pull or interest towards me. But this little priest, he seemed like such an old man, and he was 65, I remember. Which now I look at 65 as pretty young. I'm 76. And so 65 is not quite a young buck, but definitely. But he was an old man then. I remember thinking, this is an old man. And he managed to get me to that Catholic church, and that's where I met these people, the Rossis, that I lived with when I met these guys who, and then they were sent up to Harmony Gates, where I was up there by then again. Because I came and went, everybody kind of went and came and went a few times, because living in this commune was so unharmonious that everybody kind of came and went. Maybe, I mean, we were all pretty young. Maybe we went to visit our parents, whatever we did. And I remember I spent some time at the Rossies. And then I ended up spending more time at Anthony's place. And then Melody came and then married Anthony. But John and Joyce got together and had their baby right in Anthony's house. And I delivered that baby too. And that would have been in, 73, maybe, 73, 74. And I delivered that baby. But he got hit by a car when he was 6 and killed. And that was the beginning of the cemeteries. There's a whole cemetery story in the valley too, which I played a major part in.
Oh really? Can you tell us about that?
Well, Micah's death and Bob's death. But we haven't gotten to Bob's death yet either.
Yeah, let's hear about this then.
You want Micah's cemetery? The beginning of the cemetery was either Micah or Bob. I can't remember. I can't remember which one. I think it was Bob. So Bob was Bob Nelson from Harmony Gates. He was in the video, and he was one of the major players. He and Louisa come up from California, Southern California, and they had brought Morning Glory when they came, and then they had Josh, and that's the baby that Carolyn DeMarco and I delivered in the log house. And Bob was determined to get electricity into the property. We still never had electricity. And he was determined to get this electricity in. And Gary was totally into it too. And I was not. I never wanted the electricity. I liked living without it. And Bob was out there with his truck, and he was clearing space because the electric people said he had to have a swath. Back in those days, you had to clear your own swath to get electricity if you lived out in one of these boondocky places. And this was a good 3 miles from the highway. Only one, maybe less than a kilometer from that Perry's Road, and it branched off, and there was this pretty funky old road that led up to this Chernankov property that had been Doukhobors, and they grew jam there when it was the Doukhobors, and that jam went to the jam factory in Nelson. And that happened way before it was all passed, and that was all over with by the time this crew of hippies all showed up there. Am I in the middle of a story and I'm forgetting it?
Yeah, so you're talking about Bob Nelson's death there?
Yeah, he died in that process. And when he died, Mary Seaweed had come back and was visiting me and Louise. Louise is still living there. I'm still living there. Gary is still living there. And Mary Seaweed, who had come and gone a bunch of times, she was there that day. And by this time, I was married to Arrest Date. That's another whole story. There's no end to stories. And Arrest Date was in the process of adopting my daughter, whose name was Eurydice. We called her Sweet Pea. By this time, we were calling her Riddy. And Tor had a girlfriend who came up with the name Riddy. So we all thought, okay, we'll call her Riddy. Because Sweet Pea, she's sort of outgrown Sweet Pea. Now she's 7 years old, and I'd already had Antonio. And so there was a social worker who had come to interview Arreste so that he could adopt my daughter. And so he was at our house along with Mary Seaweed and me and Arreste and Maria and Antonio the baby. And Maria is 7 years old at this time. And the social worker was there at our house. Up at Bob and Louise's house, there was Louise, Kathy Angernon, and she had Morning Glory and Josh, the baby that Carolyn and I delivered. And Bob and Gary were cutting slash to do this power, to bring the electrical power in. And so this is 76 by this time. And Bob fell off the truck, and Gary panicked. He didn't know what to do, and he ran to our house, which was a good distance because this was clear down on the road before you even got up to the fields. And then you crossed a creek, and then there was the log house, and then there was the A-frame over here. And we're in the A-frame. And Gary, maybe he didn't come in the truck because the truck was there with Bob, and Bob had fallen over. Anyway, Gary panicked. He ran to the house, and the social worker, whose name was David something, he and I ran down there, and Gary panicked. He said, Bob's dead, or Bob had a heart attack. I don't know, Bob. And he was running along yelling this. And up at Louise's house was Louise and Kathy Angernon. And it was Kathy's birthday, so it was December the 10th. And they had spaghetti or something for lunch. And then Bob went back to work with Gary. Arreste, who probably had been working with him, was at the house with me and Mary Seaweed, and Louise and me and Oreste and Gary jumped in our little car. We had a little car, and we zoomed back down to where Bob was, and Kathy and Mary Seaweed took care of all these babies and kids, and they had some babies and kids of their own with them at that time. I had delivered Mary's daughter, Rose, who actually became the principal of the Valican Hole after it moved to Winlaw. She's no longer with them, but I'm still in touch to some level with Rose and her mother, Mary, whose name by that time had turned to Hodwitz. And that baby, Rose, I delivered Rose, but that was in Edgewood, so a long ways away. But Mary was visiting, and she had Rosie with her. And Josh and Rosie were the same age. Louise and Mary both had children very close to each other in age. And I remember me and David jumped in there and were giving Bob resuscitation, mouth to mouth. And I guess Gary must have gone down to the closest neighbors, who were called the Truans, Marcel and John Truan. And the people that live there now are Joel Russ and Lou. She's a potter. They're kind of known people, and they're still there. But at that time, it was Marcel and John Truan, and they had a phone and electricity, and he was a pilot. I mean, these were very straight people in the valley. And Gary must have gone down there and called, and an ambulance had come up, and the ambulance guys had gotten Bob into this ambulance, and the social worker, David, and myself and Louise got into the ambulance, and everybody else stayed back at the commune. And we took off to Nelson in this ambulance, giving this man mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And we were trading back and forth. And there was a flat tire right in front of the co-op. We're going 90, I don't know if it was kilometers or miles in those days, but we were doing 90, and all of a sudden there was a huge blowout and a flat tire in the ambulance, which turned out to be a blessing, because Carolyn DeMarco was in the co-op, and she came running over and declared Bob dead. And she took me and Louise back to her house, and she gave Louise some sedatives, and Bob went on to town in the ambulance. I have no idea what happened to the social worker, David, but he didn't come with me and Louise and Carolyn, and I don't know. He must have had a car back up at Harmony Gates. I don't know. You know, these things, can't remember everything. And so Bob died, and we had a big funeral in Nelson at the Cathedral of the Catholic Church, because Father Monahan had been coming around, and anyway, that's where we had it. And I remember Oreste sang a beautiful song. And then Louise and Morning Glory and Josh went back to California. She just couldn't stay on that commune in that little log house with 2 children and no Bob. And we didn't know, we had a body, Bob's body, and it was at Thompson's Funeral Parlor, which became Max and Irma's, and now it's called Amanda's. And that was a funeral parlor at the time. And I remember we went there to try and find a casket and everything. I think someone ended up making a casket. And I remember I was running around. If there was something I did, it was running around and taking care of these kinds of things. And I had friends who were Doukhobors in the Appledale Perry Siding area, and there was a cemetery there, the Doukhobor Cemetery of Perry Siding. And we got them to let us put Bob in there. And that's where Bob went. And then Micah got hit by a car around the same time. I'm not sure who came first, but Micah was also put in that cemetery. And there's a woman who has now passed away. Her name is Jenny Ash. And she lived in Winlaw. And she had twins, Max and Emily. And she had these twins at home. And Emily died and Max lived. They were little preemies. And she was very determined not to go to the hospital, not to get involved with the medical system at all. Why? I don't know. She came from Illinois, I believe. And the father of these twins, his name is Eli Newman, and he's still alive. Max is still there, and she had another son whose name is Noam, and they came to the valley probably around mid-70s sometime. I can't remember when they came, but then after she and the husband split up, and I think the husband had Noam for quite a while, and she had Max and Emily died, and Emily went into the Doukhobor Cemetery too. There was a lot of talk between her and Joyce and Louise had no interest in moving Bob, and Joyce never did move Micah. And whether Emily ever got moved or not, I don't know. But there was a woman whose name was Gretchen Pratt, and the Pratts were a family that lived in Perry Siding, Appledale area. And it was Michael and Gretchen Pratt, and they had 4 children. Martin, who was the same age as Maria or Sweet Pea and Morning Glory, and Martin were all the same age. And then there was also Melissa Woodward, who they were all within a year of each other. And then there was James Pratt, and there was Stevie Pratt, and there was Barbara Pratt. And Michael Pratt was a scientist of some sort. And the whole anyway, he and Gretchen and James and Martin, I don't know about Stevie by this time, but they went to Africa to do Michael's work. And Gretchen died. And she came, they wanted to bury her, and the Doukhobors no longer wanted to take any more of our bodies, our hippie bodies. And so a cemetery was created that's now called Dumont Creek Cemetery, and it's in Winlaw, and Corky Evans played a major role in doing the cat work. He did work for us too at Harmony Gates. Him and Bernie did logging together, and Mel Thompson was also involved in this logging around the valley, and all this was happening, and Corky made this cemetery happen, and Gretchen was the first person to go in that cemetery. And that's why I told the Pratt story. And Michael Pratt died this last winter. And at the funeral, there was Corky, and I was there, and there was Gretchen's grave, and my son Joseph, who was with me, that's my middle son, he was there, and he saw the whole thing, and that's Gretchen Pratt, that's Michael Pratt's first wife, and now Michael was getting buried next to her. So that's the cemetery stories.
That's great. Yeah, we're looking to include this cemetery story in this piece, so that's fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Louisa. Can I ask about what was your favorite things about those times living on a commune?
Oh, I just love the idea of living communally. It was always such a nice idea, And we did have some very good years of living commune, like it with when we lived on that property. But you know, when you look at a whole lifetime, it wasn't that long. But the idea, I love the idea, and it was really accomplished between a lot of us who never actually lived together, other than myself and Louise and Mary Seaweed and Joyce and Anthony. You know, like there was definitely years of wonderful fellowship, and the David and Susan Robertson and Bruce and Patty Ray, and then they split up, and then Patty was gone and Bruce was back and forth all the time, and he'd leave his kids off, and his kids fit right into my kids' stair steps, you know, age-wise. But all that fell apart. Everything fell apart. And some of the very first people who came to the valley, their names were Patrick and Brenda, and they lived in the Pratt's house. The Pratts didn't even live there for the first few years that I lived there, even though they'd bought this property. Armstrong, it was Patrick and Brenda Armstrong, and they were living in the Pratt's house, and the Robertsons actually lived with them too. And so there was these various groups of people and communes and communities, and a lot of that kind of thing went on for many years.
And what do you miss about those times?
Which ones?
Well, I mean, both. I mean, we're talking about, yes, the commune, but also the communal house days as well. I think that's of interest. What do you miss about?
I can't really say I miss anything, because I'm very pleased with myself now and the life I live now and the home I have now. And I've been in this house since September of 1984. And there's a whole story around how I ended up here and how I left the valley for good. But I lived in the valley until 83.
Why did you leave the valley then? What was the reason?
1983. We now have electricity. We have a bathroom with a toilet in it and a bathtub. We have a refrigerator. We have a freezer. We have an addition to the A-frame. My husband Oreste built an addition. We've got, Louise and Bob were gone because Bob died and Louise left. Gary and Becky were still living out in the first house. Bruce and Patty Ray were split up, but Bruce was out there and he had the kids a lot of the time. And David and Susan Robertsons were living above the Griffiths with Brad and Christine, who were above them, and the Griffiths were where Pamela Stevens is now, who's a known person, and her son Bren is an artist, and we all know each other and have kept in touch. But we're the Northern Valley people. We're not the Valakan people, even though that was part of the route. What was the question that we're following?
So why did you leave the valley?
Okay, so what happened in August of 83 is my mother died. Now back 4 years before that, my father had had a massive stroke. This was down in LA. They were living in Bel Air at the time. And my father had a massive stroke, which totally debilitated him. And it took him 4 years to go from being basically a vegetable to being well enough to make my mother's life very stressful. And he was kept on phenobarbital and downers to just get through the day. And my mother was stressed to the max. And she had to deal with my father's business. His secretary had also died. His best friend and lawyer had just died. And now my father had this massive stroke, and my mother was stressed to the max. And 4 years later, she went into a coma. And my sister was able to call me because by this time I have a phone and electricity and all those nice things. And my sister said, and her daughter was up spending the summer with me, quite often her children. Her son actually lived, my sister's son, Shane, lived with me for 2 years when he was 15 and 16. So I was always taking people in and having people come and go in my life. I still do. You wouldn't know it today, but I do. Anyway, so my sister called and said, Mama just went into a coma. Get down here as quick as you can. I was able, in 83, I was able to take my niece's ticket and get on a plane that afternoon and fly to LA. Pretty amazing. You certainly couldn't do that now. But in those days, I could. And I went down there, and my mother died of a brain tumor, which was cancer in the brain. And my father lived alone in their house, and I went down when Bob died, and I went down with Louise, but this was well after that. So I got down there on Angie's plane ticket, and so I called Arrest Day. I let him know. I said, this is a big one. You're going to have to close up the farm and come down with the kids, and we're going to have to stay here with my dad. And I told my dad, who couldn't talk. He never did talk again, but I quickly got him off all the phenobarb, and I got him a new doctor and all the rest of it, and he never talked again. But I said, Daddy, I'll stay 1 year, and then I'm going back to Canada. And he really wanted to live with me. He did not. My sister wanted to move into their house with him. He did not want that. He really wanted to live with me. And he really got along well with my husband, Oreste. So we stayed in LA for that year of 83, and then we came up to Nelson, and the farm was just way too far out and way too funky and way too difficult of a lifestyle for my father, who by this time was in his 60s. But, I mean, he seemed like such an old man, too. And my mother was already dead at 60. So we stayed that year, and then we bought this house. We sold my dad's house. I dealt with all the different business. My sister and I worked together, and we dealt with all my father's business dealings, and he was a major business person. And to this day, I still own property down there, and that's how come I have money, which obviously I do. And so I still have business down there. My sister has since died. She also died at 60 of ALS. But that's how this house was got, and then we moved from the farm. So that was 84. And we didn't sell the property. And Louise, who had put a bit of money in to begin with, was still hanging on, even though she hadn't lived there since Bob died in 76. And I believe we sold that property in 90, very close to 90. And it basically sat empty, other than maybe I had some renters in there and various buildings and things like that. But it was pretty funky, and by that time, nobody was too interested in living that way, basically, I'd say. So that's how I got here.
What's become of the property now?
Well, every year, I call them my old girls. There's a whole bunch of us who get together here, and we do it. We don't have a particular time of year and do it every year, but within that group, there is Mel Thompson, who is the one we talked about already, and there's Joyce, who became Joyce Morton after Judy Morton and John had split up. Then Joyce and John had Micah, whose baby died. And then they had a couple more kids. And they ended up moving back to Berkeley after living on David Orcott's property. And they had bought property from David, and they built a lovely house. And this was all Perry siding up there near the Flying Hearts and all these other little so they sort of had a bit of a commune. And Judy Bradford, who was part of, and David, there was a whole bunch of this kind of stuff going on in the Perry siding area. And I know everybody, and I remember everything. But you don't want all these stories. They just are endless.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, and last question, here we go. So how do you think living on a commune and being part of the counterculture movement has affected your life?
Well, it certainly was a big, big chapter. I would say a big, big chapter, but as you can pick up from all my stories, there are so many other stories. I mean, my stories, I am a living story. And I have lived probably one of the most amazing lives of anybody I've ever known. And there's nobody I'd rather be. Even though there are definitely times when I just wish I was dead. But that's part of my Scorpio nature, I'm sure. And I'm a liver of life.
Okay.
So I don't regret anything. But an interesting piece to my personal story is this partner who I have now, who I've never actually legally married. We've had a wedding here, and he came to Nelson in the mid-90s, and we met in 98. And we, on our first date, decided that anything we could agree upon, we could do. And we both had plenty of money. I had this house. He had a beautiful house. He still has it in Nelson, up in Mountain Station. And David Dobie, that was David Dobie's first house. And this had been Howie Hornby's house. And we did this renovation, and he was a psychiatrist in Nelson, and he had an office here. He made a beautiful office in that cabin out there. And we've been living here together for over 25 years now. We met 26 years ago. And we ride a tandem bicycle. And in our tandem bicycling, we've been all over the world, but right now, and for the last, I don't know, ever since the rails to trails, I remember when it was a train, and when the train went out, it took a long time, but it became the rails to trails, and we go out to the valley, and we do the rails to trails, and we do Valakut. We go from Passmore around to Perry Siding. And we do the highway, we do the back road, and we do the rails to trails, and we go to Frog Peak, and we go to Crestova, and so we ride this tandem all over the place. We even go all the way out to Lardo to see Stephen O'Shea, who's still living out there and is the funkiest. He was the original. He's one of the originals. He really is. But I haven't seen him now since last summer. So the tandem bicycle has gotten me back to the valley. And in riding around, now we're talking over 20 years, we've been riding this tandem in the valley. And I ride along and I see all the places and I remember all the stories and I remember all the people, and I go along, oh right, that's Judy Ciroli's place, and oh yeah, that's where Carolyn DeMarco lived. And before Carolyn, it was Marty Hyken and Susan. And I remember Susan from Topanga because I was in the Topanga group too from California. And I lived in Mendocino, and Louise went from LA to Garberville, which is right near Mendocino, and she came up here. And then there's Dinah Stanley, who got together with Norm White, who was with Judy Caldwell, and Linda White, who is now Linda Gabler, and she lives up at the New Family. And that's how, over all these years, we've all known each other. But as people die and people get sick and people go away, those of us who remain, we know who we are and we see each other. And there's a connection that just comes out of years of being around the Kootenays. So there's a real Kootenay thing that I started in April of 1970. And Norm and Linda Norm came in April of 1970 also. And all the years that he's been going from Linda to Judy to life and the valley and everything, now that he's living in Queens Bay with my girlfriend Dinah, who also came from LA, and she had come up here and we met up here. And we all lived like 5-10 minutes from each other down in LA, but we never met till we were up here. But I did meet a lot of the Topanga people, like Marty Hyken and Susan, and there was a bunch of, she's changed her name. A lot of people changed their names. So there's a bunch of stuff that goes on and has gone on and is still going on.
Fantastic. Right. I think that's a great place to end it.
Good.
Thank you so much.